Welcome to the Paris Cachée podcast. In each episode, we travel to a new arrondissement of Paris to reveal one lieu caché, the hidden place. It might be a mysterious monument, a quirky café, a secret garden, or a shop frozen in time. No matter what it is, it'll always be hidden in plain sight and always have an intriguing story to tell. I'm your host, Lily Heisey of the blog Je T'aime Me Neither and author of 3 books on Paris, including my latest called There's Only One Paris, Tales for Our Times. I've been living in Paris for over 20 years and I'm always on the lookout for the city's best, cool, and secret spots. So, without further ado, let's uncover our latest Paris Cachée. Our last episode on the first arrondissement featured a quirky collection of characters, including a queen,
Davvero?
an astrologer,
You will die near Saint-Germain.
and a psychic.
Then he dies a cruel death.
In this episode, we'll also encounter some curious figures. Kings, gladiators, actors, blue children? Blue children? Well, sort of. And lastly, a different sort of, queen. To meet them, we have to get walking. Walking to the second arrondissement of Paris. Although the second is the smallest of Paris's 20 districts, it's filled with all kinds of hidden spots. Today, we're going to visit one which I discovered not that long ago. I was checking out a newly opened comedy club on Rue Saint-Denis called The Fridge, which is, in itself, a hidden place. The comedy club is accessed through a secret entrance, as is its restaurant. When you find the latter, you'll discover a small courtyard terrace. Well, I thought it was a courtyard. But then I noticed people walking by on the other side of the terrace's glass wall. There had to be a passageway along the side of the building, so I went to investigate. Indeed, out on the street, at number 64 Rue Saint-Denis, was an ancient-looking archway, through which was a laneway. A public lane that I'd never noticed, despite the fact that I'd walked by here countless times. A sign indicated that it was called le passage de la Trinité, Trinity Passageway. Paris has many passageways, and used to have even more. Commercial passageways, especially covered ones, were very à la mode in the early 1800s, and the second arrondissement has a plethora of these. However, there was something different about this winding one, which twists and turns between Rue Saint-Denis and Rue de Palestro. It looked much older, and not necessarily purpose-built like the others in the district. I could sense that it had an interesting history, so I went digging. In fact, the passageway has had many lives, but its history is intrinsically linked to that of its location on Rue Saint-Denis. Ah, Rue Saint-Denis. The reason I, and likely you too, have never noticed this beguiling lane before is because one generally looks straight ahead and walks as quickly as possible when taking the seedy Rue Saint-Denis. Home to the older of Paris's two red light districts, the south end of the street has a scattering of run-down sex shops and dilapidated X-rated cinemas, whereas the north end of the street still has a different sort of walker. Street walkers. Nevertheless, the street, especially in the stretch where Passage de la Trinité is found, between Rue Etienne Marcel and Rue Réaumur, has gradually received the residual effects of the gentrification of the parallel street, Rue Montorgueil, which has become increasingly trendy. However, Rue Saint-Denis wasn't always unsavory. It's actually one of the oldest existing streets in the city, and surprisingly used to be one of Paris's most prestigious streets. To understand this, we have to go back in time, all the way back to Roman Paris. We'll be right back with Paris Cachée after a word from our sponsors.
What bra are you wearing right now? Whether you're smiling from ear to ear because you love your bra, or whether you winced because you're wearing, yet again, something you'd rather not, tune into Paris Undressed, the podcast that goes behind the seams of the lingerie capital of the world. Hi, I'm Kate Kemp Griffin, author and host of Paris Undressed. From boudoir to the street, we'll explore the art of making and wearing French lingerie. We'll meet the designers and brands shaping our bodies and talk to fascinating people about femininity, sensuality, and sexuality. We'll share bra stories, secrets, desires, hopes, and dreams. This is the ultimate special occasion. So put on your favorite bra and tune into Paris Undressed, Tuesdays on Paris Underground Radio.
What's the recipe for a successful cooking podcast? Hire some experienced hosts.
I'm Omid Tavalai.
And I'm Alana McPherson Tavalai.
We're otherwise known as Emperor Norton. We've been doing this for years. Neither of us has lost any appendages.
You're not building confidence.
Don't make sweeping generalizations or engage in stereotypes. Because that's what romantic couples do here in the City of Light and love and romance.
Vous faites des burgers et des brownies.
Skip the off-holiday humor.
Not like child exploitation or something.
Do engage in woman-splaining.
Actually, a lot of recipes use both baking powder and baking soda.
Sprinkle liberally with dad jokes.
I don't know what kind of baking powder I'm buying.
It's all single acting. Just
Okay.
so you know.
Just like the men here. They're single acting.
Help me.
And maybe actually a useful recipe once in a while. Tune in to The Transplant Kitchen, a podcast by two Californian chefs in France with a global mindset for cooking, on Paris Underground Radio.
And now, back to Paris Cachée. Column temples, colossal colosseums, gladiator competition, men in togas. Okay, maybe the weather in Paris was never mild enough for toga wearing. Nevertheless, there was a substantial Roman presence in the city for several hundred years following the conquest of Gaul by Caesar in 52 BCE. Called Lutetia, their city of around 10,000 inhabitants was located on the Ile de la Cité and on the left bank, in what ended up being called, centuries later, and for a completely different reason, the Latin Quarter. But perhaps we'll discuss Roman Paris in more depth when we reach that part of town. Despite its concentration to the south, there was, however, a bridge across the Seine, which extended into a road, which was eventually called Rue Saint-Denis, as it goes off in the direction of Saint-Denis, or rather the Cathedral of Saint Denis, the final resting place of this important French saint and many French royals. The city eventually expanded over to the right bank, and when it did, it is thought that Rue Saint-Denis was likely the first street to have houses on it. It later became one of Paris's voies triomphales, the road in which royals would enter the city on important occasions, like after the coronation of a new king, the arrival of a queen, or an important military victory. Indeed, one of the triumphal arches constructed by Louis XIV still stands at the end of Rue Saint-Denis, where it meets Les Grands Boulevards, the former border of Paris and where the Charles V city wall stood. These grand events, which sometimes only took place every few decades, brought all of Paris about to watch the procession of royals, the clergy, the Prévôt des Marchands de Paris, the civic authorities, and other dignitaries. The streets would be lined in silk drapery, royal insignia, flags, and other fanfare. Theatrical performances and music added to the festive ambiance. It might seem hard to imagine this today, as you scamper past the street's raunchy shops faster than a royal horse at a speedy gallop. Entering the city, walls, gateways, kings. These topics are all intrinsically linked to the history of our Passage de la Trinité. In 1180, Philippe Auguste became King of France, and during his 43-year reign, he undertook several large-scale building works in Paris. The most consequential of these was the building of a giant wall around the city to protect it against possible invaders. The wall was huge, 6 to 9 meters high, and extended a distance of 2.8 kilometers on the right bank and 2.6 kilometers on the left. On the right bank, this wall traveled approximately from the Louvre, along Rue Saint-Honoré, fringed Rue Tiquetonne, and then arched over to Rue Franc-Bourgeois, down Rue Jardin Saint-Paul in the Marais, to reach the edge of the Seine. To put this into perspective to today's Paris, the périphérique, the ring road around the city, and roughly its current-day city limits, is a total of 35 kilometers, so around 7 times bigger than back then. It would have taken less than an hour to walk the full length of the medieval right bank of the city, whereas it would take 4 to 5 hours to journey the contemporary limits, depending on if you're walking at a leisurely pace or racing past seedy sex shops pace. In 1201, right in the middle of Philippe Auguste's reign and the construction of his gigantic wall, 2 half-brothers, Willem Effectual and Jean de la Passageways, obtained a permit to build a refuge for royal pilgrims who arrived at the city after the gates closed for the evening. A plot of land was allotted to them immediately north of the wall at the Saint-Denis Gate. At the time, the area was called Croix de la Reine, or the Queen's Cross. As such, when the complex was completed the following year, it was called l'Hôpital de la Croix de la Reine. Now, the word hôpital can be misleading. This complex was not a hospital, or the current-day definition of the word. Hôpital, and thus hospital, come from the Latin word hospitalia, which means a room for guests. It went on to signify a place to serve the homeless or needy, which was its use here, to put a roof over the heads of these stranded pilgrims. The complex was a walled enclave and consisted of a few separate buildings and a chapel. A few years after its construction, in 1207, it was renamed l'Hôpital de la Trinité, which is where its current name comes from. But the site has had a few other purposes and names since then. For around 150 years, the refuge went on peacefully taking care of these tardy pilgrims, and life was probably pretty good. That is, until 1347, the date of the outbreak of the Black Plague, which, over the course of the next 4 years, killed off 50 to 80,000 Parisians, about a third of the population. It makes our pandemic today seem rather small. But they didn't have as sophisticated healthcare back then. The city's cemeteries were overflowing. As such, in 1353, the refuge's administrators gave in to the pressure of the Prévôt de Paris, those civil authorities mentioned before, to lease part of their land to the city for a desperately needed new cemetery. The deed stipulated that the bourgeois and the residents of Paris were allowed to enter it whenever and as often as they liked. The cost of being buried here was 18 deniers for an individual grave, 8 for a mass grave, and 6 for a child, about 12, 5, and 4 euros respectively. Paris's cemeteries weren't the only thing overflowing. The city as a whole was spilling beyond its 5.5-kilometer bridges, or rather, wall. So, in 1365, King Charles V commissioned a new wall for the right bank, which then would extend from Place de la Bastille along the Grand Boulevard and over to just beyond the Louvre. This meant that the Hôpital de la Trinité was now within the Paris city limits and could thus no longer serve those after-hours pilgrims. Nevertheless, it still carried on with charitable activities. In 1402, the Confrères de la Passion, the Brotherhood of Passion, a theatre troupe, got permission from the next king, Charles VI, to put on their plays in a large room within the refuge's complex. This effectively made it the first theatre in all of Paris. Now, don't be getting grand thoughts of Shakespearean, or rather Molièrean prose in your head. Their plays were instead mysteries from the Gospels, or more simply put, Bible stories. Well, actually, the Bible does get exciting now and then. And perhaps the Brotherhood of Passion knew how to tease out the most passionate parts. A little nod to the modern-day passions of Rue Saint-Denis? Either way, the plays were a big hit, and the Hôpital was one of the most popular and busiest places in all of Paris, until the troupe decided to move to a different location in 1545.
We'll be right back with
Paris Cachée
after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, welcome to Wine Dine Caroline's Happy Hour. I'm Caroline Connor, a wine expert living in Lyon, France, where I am otherwise known as Wine Dine Caroline. Now, this isn't your average wine podcast. You can join me at Happy Hour, where I'll be meeting with friends, new and old, to hear a funny, stupid, or just all-out ridiculous story from their life. And then I'll pair a wine with it. Join us for belly laughs, silliness, and lots of love. Cheers!
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? It is, but there's much more to its romantic allure than the Eiffel Tower. The Romancing in Paris podcast aims to reveal the true romantic essence of the city. Secret gardens, hidden historic sites, and terribly seductive bars. Join romantic expert and writer Lily Heisey as we discover the city's best romantic spots, ideal for both curious couples and lovers of Paris alike. Ready to experience the real romantic Paris? Tune into the Romancing in Paris podcast every Wednesday on Paris Underground Radio. Visit parisundergroundradio.com/Romancing in Paris to listen and subscribe.
And now, back to Paris Cachée.
At this time, the friars shifted the raison d'etre of their complex. It became something of an orphanage that only took in children who met very specific criteria. They had to be at least 6 years old and the offsprings of parents who were impoverished, invalid, and loyally married, but who could no longer support their children. They hosted around 140 children who were fed, received a religious education, and were also taught a trade. With its evolving role, the venue's name also changed to the Hospice des Enfants Bleus, the hospice of the blue children. Blue children? Wait a second, that wasn't on the list of criteria. The color distinction in the new name actually came from the blue uniforms the children wore. The orphanage grew in prominence and was soon known across the whole country for the quality of their graduates, one of whom even became the head of the royal tapestry manufacturer. Over time, small streets were built inside the complex. These were populated by houses, and artisanal workshops and shops also gradually arrived and covered the location of the former cemetery. A few of these still remain, and have names linked to the various eras of the complex. La Cour des Bleus, the Courtyard of the Blues, La Fontaine de la Reine, the Fountain of the Queen, and the snaking lane which is now the Passage de la Trinité. During the early days of the French Revolution, in 1790, when all churches and religious property were confiscated by the state, the hospice too was taken over and closed down. In 1812, its church was sold off and then demolished. The passageway was opened as a public lane in 1827. Since then, a variety of artisans have set up shop here, which nicely maintains the traditions of the site. Those aren't the only traditions of the location which persist to this day. Think back to the beginning of the podcast. The entrance to the passageway is now occupied by a comedy club. Could this be a revival of the entertainment roots planted by the Brotherhood of Passion? You can contemplate this yourself while attending a show at Le Fridge, or on an amble through this passageway, which is best done during the day so you don't run into any of the streetwalkers of the Rue Saint-Denis. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep your eyes peeled. You never know what they may fall upon, especially in Paris. I'm your host, Lily Heisey. You can find me at jetemmeneither.com. Our theme music is Dreamer, produced by Danya Vodovaz. Additional music used in this episode includes Queen of the Celts by Ian Grimm and Messiah by Handel, performed by the Holy Angel Choir. Paris Cachée is produced by Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please go to parisundergroundradio.com.